The autumn rain fell softly against the tall windows of Riverside Academy, each droplet tracing a slow, wandering path down the old glass panes. Inside the third-floor common room, warm golden light from antique brass lamps pooled across worn leather armchairs and faded oriental rugs, creating islands of comfort in the gathering dusk. The air smelled faintly of old books, lemon polish, and the lavender sachets that the housekeeping staff tucked into the cushions each morning. Daniel Chen sat alone in the corner near the radiator, his second-hand blazer draped carefully over the chair beside him, his fingers wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. He watched the rain with a kind of patient stillness, the way someone watches something beautiful that they know will not last. His scholarship letter sat folded in his shirt pocket, the paper soft from being read and reread so many times that the creases had begun to wear thin. It reminded him, on difficult days, that he belonged here, that he had earned this place through examination scores and essay competitions and late-night studying by the dim light of his family's small apartment above the corner grocery store. The common room filled slowly as evening approached, students drifting in from afternoon activities, their voices carrying that particular cadence of people who had never known uncertainty, who moved through the world with the casual confidence of those who had always been welcomed everywhere they went. Daniel had learned to recognize that tone in his first weeks at Riverside, the way he had learned to recognize the difference between his carefully pressed second-hand uniform and the crisp, perfectly tailored blazers of his classmates. Between his sturdy but scuffed shoes and their gleaming leather ones that probably cost more than his family paid in rent each month. He did not resent them for it, not exactly. Resentment required energy, required the kind of sharp feeling that disturbed the careful equilibrium he maintained each day. Instead, he simply observed. The way a naturalist might observe birds in a habitat that was not his own, noting patterns and behaviors with a kind of gentle detachment that kept him safe from the small cruelties that occasionally came his way. Marcus Whitmore entered the common room with 3 of his friends, their laughter preceding them like a wave. Marcus was tall and golden in the way that suggested summers spent sailing and winters spent skiing, his hair perpetually tousled in a way that probably took more effort than Daniel spent on his entire morning routine. He was not unkind, not exactly, but he carried himself with the sort of careless ease that comes from never having to think about whether you belonged somewhere, never having to wonder if your presence was an imposition or a gift. Daniel had learned not to make eye contact during these moments, not from fear, but from a kind of practical wisdom. If you became invisible, became part of the furniture like the old leather chairs and the brass lamps and the faded rugs, then you could simply exist in peace, could focus on your studies and your books and the quiet satisfaction of learning things that would, someday, carry you somewhere else entirely. But this evening, Marcus paused near Daniel's corner, his friends gathering around him like planets around a sun. The conversation had turned, as it often did, to the upcoming autumn formal, to who was attending with whom, to the expensive suits being tailored and the elaborate dinner reservations being made at restaurants in the city. Daniel kept his eyes on his book, his fingers turning the page with careful precision, trying to project an aura of complete absorption in the text before him. It was a book on architectural history, borrowed from the library, and he had been reading about the bridges of ancient Rome, about how they built things to last, about how stone and engineering could outlive empires. Someone mentioned the cost of the formal tickets, laughing about the price the way you laugh about something that has no real meaning to you, and Daniel felt that familiar tightness in his chest, that awareness that the ticket cost more than his family spent on groceries in a month, that attending would require a suit he did not own and could not afford, that there were some parts of Riverside Academy that his scholarship could not reach. Marcus's voice floated over the conversation, warm and easy. Everyone should come. It's tradition. The formal is like the whole point of autumn term. One of his friends, a boy named Jeremy with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual smirk, glanced toward Daniel's corner. Well, almost everyone, he said, and there was something in his tone, not quite cruel but not quite kind either, that made the other students follow his gaze. Daniel kept reading, or pretended to keep reading, his eyes fixed on the page even though the words had stopped making sense, even though all he could see was the blur of text and the knowledge that he had, somehow, become visible again when he had tried so hard to remain unseen. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, as though some part of him recognized that a line was being approached, that the conversation was tilting toward something unkind. But he did not stop it, did not redirect it, and his silence felt, in its own way, like agreement. Some people have, other priorities, Jeremy continued, warming to his theme. Academic types, too busy with their books to worry about social events. The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that everyone in the room understood. Daniel turned another page of his book with steady hands, refusing to show that he had heard, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He had learned this skill over months of similar moments, this ability to become stone, to let words wash over him like rain over marble, leaving no mark, no impression, no evidence that they had landed at all. The conversation moved on, as conversations do, but something in the room had shifted, some invisible boundary had been marked. Daniel stayed in his corner until the common room emptied for dinner, and then he gathered his books with careful hands and walked slowly back to his dormitory, taking the long route through the quiet corridors where portraits of alumni watched from the walls with patient, knowing eyes. His room was small, tucked under the eaves on the 4th floor, with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the grounds. It had been a servant's room once, back when the academy had been a private estate, and Daniel sometimes thought about those servants, about the other people who had lived and worked in spaces like this, invisible to the people in the grand rooms below, essential but unseen. He made himself another cup of tea using the small electric kettle that sat on his desk, a gift from his mother when he left for Riverside. The water heated slowly, filling the small room with its quiet, bubbling sound, and Daniel stood by the window watching the grounds disappear into darkness, the old trees becoming shadows, the pathways vanishing into night. Tomorrow there would be classes, and Daniel loved his classes with a fierce, quiet devotion. He loved the way Professor Hartley taught history, making the past feel alive and present and meaningful. He loved the precision of mathematics, the way numbers behaved predictably, followed rules, created patterns you could trust. He loved the science labs with their gleaming equipment and careful procedures, the way experiments revealed truths that existed independent of wealth or status or social standing. These things, he told himself as he sipped his tea and watched the darkness, these things belonged to everyone who was willing to work for them. Knowledge did not care if your blazer was second-hand or your shoes were scuffed. Understanding did not require the right accent or the right address or an invitation to the autumn formal. He studied late into the night, as he always did, his desk lamp creating a small island of warm light in the darkness, his textbooks spread around him like faithful companions. Outside, the rain continued its patient work against the window, and somewhere in the building other students slept in rooms warmer and larger than his, dreaming dreams he could not imagine, waking to futures that seemed already assured. But Daniel had his own dreams, quieter ones, built on different foundations. He dreamed of graduating, of university, of becoming an architect and designing buildings that would last, that would serve some purpose beyond mere luxury, that would stand as proof that someone who started in a small apartment above a grocery store could build something meaningful and true. The weeks passed with the slow, cyclical rhythm of academic life. Classes in the morning, library in the afternoon, evening study in his small room under the eaves. Daniel developed routines that kept him focused and grounded, little rituals of tea and reading and careful note-taking that created structure in a world that often felt uncertain. He found his community, such as it was, among the other scholarship students, the handful of young people who navigated Riverside with similar quiet determination. There was Maya, whose parents had immigrated from India and who wanted to become a doctor. There was James, who had grown up in foster care and dreamed of teaching. There was Lynn, whose family ran a restaurant and who sketched constantly, filling notebooks with designs for buildings and bridges and spaces that seemed to exist in some gentler, kinder world than this one. They studied together in the library, claimed a table near the back where the light was soft and the chairs were comfortable and no one bothered them. They shared notes and textbooks, split the cost of study guides, helped each other through difficult concepts with patient explanations and quiet encouragement. They did not talk much about the autumn formal or the winter skiing trip or the spring break adventures that occupied so much of the general student conversation. They talked instead about their classes, about their futures, about the small victories of understanding something new or completing something difficult. Professor Hartley noticed Daniel in class, the way he always sat in the front row, the way his handwritten notes were meticulous and thorough, the way he asked questions that suggested he had been thinking deeply about the material, turning it over in his mind long after the lecture ended. One afternoon, after a particularly engaging discussion about urban planning and ancient civilizations, she asked him to stay behind for a moment. Daniel gathered his books with careful hands, aware that several of his classmates were watching with expressions of vague curiosity, wondering what trouble he might be in, what infraction he might have committed. But Professor Hartley's expression was warm as she gestured to the chair beside her desk. "Daniel, I've been impressed with your work this term. Your essay on Roman aqueducts was exceptional. Have you thought about what you might want to study at university?" The question opened something in Daniel's chest, some tight knot of worry he had been carrying without fully acknowledging. That someone had noticed, that someone saw potential in him beyond his scholarship status, beyond his second-hand blazer and his small room under the eaves, felt like being handed a gift he had not known to hope for. "Architecture," he said quietly, the word feeling both presumptuous and exactly right. "I want to design buildings. Public buildings, maybe? Libraries and schools and spaces where everyone is welcome." Professor Hartley smiled, and it was a smile of genuine warmth, of recognition. "That's a beautiful goal, and I think you have exactly the right mind for it. Architecture requires both creativity and precision, vision and practicality. It requires understanding how people move through space, how environments affect experience. I think you see those things already." She recommended books, suggested professors at various universities he might want to study with, promised to write him a recommendation letter when the time came. As Daniel left her classroom that afternoon, he felt something shift inside him, some small seed of hope taking root in soil that had been carefully prepared through months of patient work. The autumn term deepened, the trees on the grounds transforming into shades of amber and rust and gold. Daniel walked the campus early in the mornings, before most students were awake, watching the mist rise from the old stone buildings, observing the way light changed the appearance of familiar spaces. He started carrying a small notebook, sketching buildings and doorways and windows, trying to understand what made some spaces feel welcoming and others feel forbidding. The formal came and went, a Saturday evening when the academy transformed into something glittering and expensive, when music drifted from the main hall and students in elegant clothes moved through the corridors like actors in some elaborate production. Daniel spent the evening in the library, which was blessedly empty, working on a research paper about sustainable architecture. Through the tall windows, he could occasionally hear laughter and music, but it felt distant, as though it belonged to a different world entirely, one that ran parallel to his, but rarely intersected with it. Maya found him there around 10 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the kitchen where she had befriended one of the staff members. She set one down beside his stack of books without comment, and they worked in companionable silence until midnight, until the sounds of the formal finally faded and the building settled into its usual quiet. "Did you ever wish you could go?" Maya asked as they packed up their books, her voice soft in the empty library. Daniel considered the question carefully, trying to be honest with himself. "Maybe," he said finally. "Not because I care about formals exactly, but because it would be nice to just belong somewhere without having to think about it all the time, to not always be calculating whether you can afford something or whether people are looking at your clothes or whether you're supposed to be somewhere." Maya nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My parents keep asking if I'm having fun here, and I am, in my way. But it's not the kind of fun they imagined when I got the scholarship. It's the fun of learning things, of working towards something. That's enough, I think, but it would be nice if it felt easier sometimes." They walked back to their dormitories through corridors that still smelled faintly of perfume and expensive cologne, past decorations that would be taken down in the morning, past evidence of a celebration they had not been part of. But there was something companionable about their exclusion, something that bound them together, and as Daniel climbed the stairs to his small room under the eaves, he felt less alone than he had in weeks. Winter arrived at Riverside with characteristic New England intensity, bringing early darkness and the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the old stone walls and settle into your bones. The grounds became a study in gray and white, the bare trees standing like careful sketches against low clouds, the pathways dusted with snow that crunched underfoot with a satisfying sound. Daniel learned to navigate the winter term with its particular rhythms and challenges. The small radiator in his room barely kept the space warm enough, and he took to studying in the library until it closed each night, then hurrying back through the cold to slip into bed wearing layers of clothes, burrowing under his thin blanket and the heavy coat his mother had insisted he bring, reading by flashlight until sleep finally came. The scholarship students had started a small tradition of gathering on Sunday evenings in James's slightly larger room, which had the advantage of a more functional heater. They would pool their resources, buying cheap ingredients from the grocery store in town and cooking simple meals on the contraband hot plate that James kept hidden in his closet. These Sunday dinners became islands of warmth in the cold week, hours when they could relax and laugh and complain about difficult professors and commiserate about expensive textbooks and dream about their futures. It was during one of these gatherings, a particularly cold evening in late January, that Daniel first mentioned his growing interest in historic preservation. He had been reading about the restoration of old buildings, about architects who specialized in maintaining the character and integrity of historic structures while making them functional for modern use. The idea resonated with something deep in him, this notion that you could honor what came before while building something new, that preservation and progress were not opposites, but partners. Lynn, who had been sketching while the others talked, looked up with sudden interest. "That's beautiful," she said. "It's like what we're doing here, in a way, taking these old buildings and these old traditions and trying to find our place in them without losing who we are." The observation struck Daniel as profoundly true, and he found himself thinking about it often in the weeks that followed. Riverside Academy was full of history, layers of it built into every stone and timber, every tradition and ritual. But history, he was learning, was not a fixed thing. It was being made constantly, reinterpreted constantly, added to by each new generation of students who walked these halls. The small moments of unkindness continued, occasional reminders that he existed on the margins of the community rather than its center. Marcus and his friends rarely spoke to him directly, but there were moments when their laughter seemed pointed, when conversation stopped when he entered a room, when group projects somehow formed without anyone thinking to include the scholarship students. But there were also moments of unexpected kindness. Professor Hartley continued to take an interest in his work, lending him books from her personal collection, telling him about architecture programs at various universities. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, started setting aside books she thought he might enjoy, creating a small stack that waited for him each week. One of the groundskeepers, an older man named Tom who had worked at Riverside for 30 years, started conversations with him during his morning walks, sharing stories about the campus history, pointing out architectural details Daniel had never noticed. These small kindnesses sustained him through the winter term, through the gray weeks when the cold seemed endless and the isolation felt heavy. He worked steadily toward his goal, maintaining his grades, building his knowledge, preparing himself for whatever came next. Spring arrived slowly at Riverside, the way it does in New England, with false starts and backward slides, snow in April followed by sudden warm days that made the trees bud too early. But eventually, inevitably, the world softened. Green returned to the grounds, crocuses pushed through the wet earth, and the light changed quality, becoming longer and more generous. Daniel's final term at Riverside unfolded with a kind of bittersweet intensity. He was leaving soon, heading to university on another scholarship, this one to study architecture at a respected program in the city. Professor Hartley had written him a recommendation that made him tear up when she showed him a copy, describing him as one of the most dedicated and thoughtful students she had taught in 20 years. The scholarship students threw him a small party on one of their Sunday evenings, making his favorite foods and presenting him with a notebook for sketching, its pages filled with their signatures and small drawings and messages of encouragement. Maya had written, "Build beautiful things for all of us." James had written, "Remember where you came from and everything it took to get here." Lynn had drawn a small bridge with two figures crossing it, one reaching back to help the other forward. On his last night at Riverside, Daniel walked the grounds one final time, moving slowly through spaces that had become familiar despite never quite feeling like home. He stopped at the library, touched the stone walls of the main building, stood under the oak tree where he had sometimes studied on warm afternoons. The campus was quiet, most students already gone for the summer, and in that quiet Daniel could hear the history of the place, could sense all the people who had walked these paths before him, all the lives that had passed through and been shaped by this institution. He did not feel triumphant exactly, but he felt something that might have been peace. He had survived Riverside Academy. More than survived, he had learned and grown and prepared himself for what came next. The small cruelties had not broken him. The isolation had not defeated him. He had kept his focus, maintained his integrity, held on to his dreams. As he climbed the stairs to his small room under the eaves for the last time, packing his few belongings into the same battered suitcase he had arrived with 3 years ago, Daniel thought about Marcus Whitmore and Jeremy and all the others who had looked through him, or past him, or at him with condescension. He did not hate them. Hate required too much energy, too much attention, and he had learned to be careful with his limited resources. Instead, he felt something more complex, a kind of understanding that they were playing different games with different rules, that their confidence came from different sources than his would, that their lives would unfold along paths that might never intersect with his again. They would inherit their father's companies or follow their mothers into law or medicine, would marry each other and buy houses in the right neighborhoods, and send their children to schools like Riverside, and there was nothing wrong with that, exactly. It was simply a different story than the one Daniel was living. His story, he was beginning to understand, was about building rather than inheriting, about creating rather than maintaining, about finding his own path rather than following one already laid out. And as he closed his suitcase and took one last look at his small room, he felt ready for whatever came next. The years that followed passed in that curious way that time has of feeling both endless and impossibly swift. Daniel threw himself into his studies at university with the same quiet devotion he had brought to Riverside. Architecture captivated him completely, the way it combined art and science, creativity and mathematics, vision and practicality. He loved the studio classes where they built models and drafted plans, loved the history classes where they studied the great buildings of the world, loved the technical classes where they learned about materials and engineering and structural systems. University was different from Riverside in ways that felt liberating. There were other scholarship students, other people from backgrounds like his who had earned their places through hard work rather than inheritance. There were professors who cared more about what you could do than where you came from. There was a sense of possibility that felt more expansive, more genuine, less constrained by tradition and social hierarchy. He worked part-time at a local architecture firm, starting with simple drafting work and gradually taking on more responsibility. The senior architect, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had also been a scholarship student years ago, became a mentor to him, teaching him not just about design, but about the business of architecture, about how to talk to clients and manage projects and navigate the complex world of building permits and construction regulations. Daniel's specialty, as he moved through his degree, became historic preservation with a focus on adaptive reuse, taking old buildings that were no longer serving their original purpose and reimagining them for new uses while maintaining their historic character. He loved the detective work of it, researching a building's history, understanding its original design intent, figuring out how to honor that while making the space functional for contemporary needs. His thesis project was a proposal to convert an old textile mill in a declining neighborhood into affordable artist studios and community spaces. The building had been abandoned for decades, its windows broken, its floors rotted. But Daniel saw past the decay to the bones of the structure, to the beautiful brickwork and the soaring ceilings, and the huge windows that had once provided light for factory workers, and could now provide light for painters and sculptors and makers of all kinds. The thesis won awards, was published in an academic journal, caught the attention of several firms that specialized in this kind of work. Upon graduation, Daniel received multiple job offers, finally accepting one from a mid-sized firm in the city, known for its innovative approach to urban renewal and community-focused design. The work was everything he had hoped for and more. He spent his days drawing and modeling and problem-solving, working on projects that range from converting old warehouses into mixed-use developments, to restoring historic theaters, to reimagining underused public buildings as community centers. Each project was a puzzle, a challenge, an opportunity to create something that would serve people, that would last, that would contribute to making cities more livable and equitable. He was good at his work, not in a flashy way, but in a steady, reliable way that his supervisors and clients appreciated. He listened carefully to what people needed, thought deeply about how spaces could serve those needs, designed with both vision and practicality. His projects came in on budget, met deadlines, solved the problems they were meant to solve. As the years passed, Daniel moved up through the firm, from junior architect to project manager to senior architect. He developed a reputation for being able to handle complex projects, for navigating the competing interests of developers and community members, and historic preservation boards with patience and diplomacy. He was the person you called when a project seemed impossible, when there were too many constraints and not enough budget and stakeholders who disagreed about everything. His personal life unfolded more quietly. He dated occasionally, but never seriously, always aware that he was pouring most of his energy into his work. He maintained his friendships with Maya and James and Lynn, the group still getting together every few months, comparing notes on their various career paths, offering support through challenges and celebration through victories. Maya was in medical school, James was teaching at an under-resourced high school. Lynn was working at an architecture firm in another city, designing public housing that was actually beautiful and dignified. Daniel's parents were proud of him in a way that felt both wonderful and complicated. His mother kept newspaper clippings about his projects, even though Daniel tried to explain that his name was usually buried in the list of credits, that architecture was more collaborative than people realized. His father asked careful questions about his work, trying to understand what exactly it was that Daniel did all day, how drawing buildings on computers translated into actual physical structures made of steel and concrete and glass. 10 years after graduating from Riverside, Daniel had become someone he barely recognized when he looked back at his younger self. He had his own apartment now, nothing fancy but comfortable and in a good neighborhood. He had savings in the bank. He had a reputation in the field. He had designed buildings that existed, that people used, that had his small mark on them. He rarely thought about Riverside Academy anymore, except in the abstract way you think about any formative experience, acknowledging its role in shaping who you became without dwelling on the specific memories. The small cruelties had faded into irrelevance, had become part of a story about resilience rather than pain. But then, one afternoon in early autumn, 12 years after he had walked out of that small room under the eaves, Daniel's phone rang with a call from Sarah Chen, who had since left the firm to start her own practice and had become a friend and continued mentor. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying that particular excitement that meant she had found something interesting. "I have a project I think you should look at. Actually, I think you're probably the only person I know who could do it justice." The project, she explained, was Riverside Academy. The school was undertaking a major campus expansion and renovation, needed to update aging infrastructure while maintaining the historic character of the buildings, wanted to add new facilities that would serve both current needs and future growth. It was a complex, multi-year project worth millions of dollars, and the Board of Trustees was looking for an architecture firm that understood both historic preservation and contemporary institutional needs. Daniel's first instinct was to decline, to pass the opportunity to someone else, to avoid returning to a place that held such complicated memories. But as Sarah talked about the scope of the project, about the opportunity to literally reshape the spaces where he had once felt so small and invisible, something shifted in his understanding. This was not about revenge or proving anything to people who probably did not remember him anyway. This was about doing work he was genuinely qualified to do, about bringing his skills and vision to a project that would affect future generations of students. It was about having the opportunity to think carefully about what spaces make people feel welcome or excluded, about how architecture can support or undermine a sense of belonging. "Send me the RFP," he said finally. "I'll take a look." The request for proposals arrived the next day, a thick document outlining the scope of work, the timeline, the budget, the school's vision for its future. Daniel spent a week reading and rereading it, walking around the city looking at his previous projects with new eyes, thinking about what he had learned in 12 years of professional practice, what he understood now that he had not understood as a student. He decided to submit a proposal, not alone but in partnership with Sarah's firm, combining his knowledge of the campus and expertise in historic preservation with her firm's resources and experience with large institutional projects. They worked for weeks on the proposal, developing concepts that honored the school's history while imagining a more inclusive future, designing spaces that would serve all students equally, creating a vision that was both respectful and forward-thinking. The presentation to the Board of Trustees was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in late October. Daniel drove to Riverside on a morning that was crisp and clear, the autumn leaves at their peak, the campus looking exactly as he remembered and yet somehow different, smaller maybe, or perhaps just viewed through eyes that had seen more of the world. He arrived early, parked in the visitor lot, and walked the grounds for an hour before the meeting. The library where he had spent so many evenings studying, the main building where Professor Hartley's classroom had been, the dormitory where he had lived in his small room under the eaves. Everything was familiar and strange simultaneously, like visiting a place from a dream. The boardroom was in the administration building, a space Daniel had never entered as a student. It was large and formal, with dark wood paneling and oil portraits of past headmasters, and a long table where the trustees sat waiting. Sarah had already arrived, was setting up their presentation materials, greeting board members with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this. Daniel recognized several faces as he entered. There was Professor Hartley, older now, but with the same warm expression, serving as faculty representative on the board. There was the headmaster, who had given the welcome speech his first day at Riverside, but whom he had never actually spoken to directly. There were several other people whose faces were vaguely familiar, alumni probably, donors, community members with ties to the school. And there, sitting near the end of the table, wearing an expensive suit and looking both older and somehow exactly the same, was Marcus Whitmore. The recognition was mutual and immediate. Daniel saw something flicker across Marcus's face. Surprise, confusion, perhaps the faint stirring of memory trying to place someone familiar from a distant context. Daniel kept his expression neutral, professional, waiting to see if Marcus would acknowledge him, say something, make the connection explicit. But Marcus simply nodded politely, the way you nod at a stranger you are about to do business with, and Daniel understood that Marcus did not actually remember him, not as a person, not as an individual with a name and a history. He might have a vague sense that Daniel's face was familiar, might remember that there had been scholarship students at Riverside when he was there, but the specific Daniel, the Daniel who had sat in the corner of the common room reading about Roman bridges, who had been the subject of Jeremy's pointed comments, who had existed in Marcus's peripheral vision for 3 years without ever being truly seen, that Daniel had left no lasting impression. The realization was oddly freeing. Daniel had not come here for recognition or vindication. He had come to present an architecture proposal, and the fact that Marcus did not remember him meant there was no old baggage to navigate, no awkward acknowledgement of past dynamics, no need to address history that only Daniel had carried forward. Sarah began the presentation, outlining their firm's experience and approach. Then Daniel took over, walking the board through their vision for the campus expansion. He spoke clearly and confidently about the historic buildings, about how to update infrastructure while maintaining character, about creating new spaces that would welcome all students, about thinking carefully about how architecture shapes experience and community. He proposed converting one of the old service buildings, not unlike the one where his dormitory had been, into a new student center focused on academic support and community building. He showed them how the spaces could be designed to feel inclusive rather than exclusive, how natural light and comfortable furniture and thoughtful layout could make everyone feel welcome regardless of their background or financial situation. He talked about adding a new library wing that would honor the old reading room while creating flexible spaces for different kinds of learning. He discussed renovating the dormitories to ensure that all students, regardless of which building they lived in, had rooms that were comfortable and dignified and adequately heated. Throughout the presentation, he was aware of Professor Hartley watching him with an expression of delighted recognition, of the headmaster nodding at key points, of Marcus leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful frown, paying attention in a way that suggested genuine engagement with the ideas being presented. When Daniel finished, there was a moment of silence, and then Professor Hartley spoke. "Mr. Chen," she said warmly, "I had a student many years ago named Daniel Chen. Would you happen to be the same person?" Daniel smiled, allowing himself to be seen, to step out of his professional role for just a moment. "Yes, Professor Hartley. I had the privilege of taking your history classes. You wrote me a recommendation letter for university. I've thought about your encouragement many times over the years." Professor Hartley's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I thought I recognized you, though I wasn't certain. This is wonderful, Daniel. You've clearly become exactly the architect I hoped you would be. The way you talk about creating inclusive spaces, about thinking carefully about how buildings affect people's sense of belonging, it's evident that you bring not just technical skill to this work, but real insight into how institutions can better serve all their students." Several other board members chimed in with questions about specific aspects of the proposal, about budget and timeline and technical details. Daniel answered each one with calm competence, drawing on 12 years of professional experience, demonstrating not just vision, but practical knowledge about how to actually execute complex projects. Marcus, who had been mostly quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. I'm curious about your emphasis on creating more equitable spaces throughout campus. Can you talk more about what you mean by that specifically? Daniel met Marcus's eyes across the table, seeing genuine curiosity there rather than challenge. Of course. In my research on the campus, both as a former student and in preparing this proposal, I noticed that certain spaces are implicitly coded as belonging to certain types of students. The formal dining hall versus the cafeteria, the main library versus the small study spaces, the newer dormitories versus the older service buildings that were converted to student housing. He paused, choosing his words carefully, wanting to be clear without being accusatory. None of this is necessarily intentional, but it creates an experience where some students feel fully welcome in all campus spaces, while others feel like they're always navigating territory that wasn't quite designed with them in mind. Good architecture can help address that by creating spaces that signal welcome to everyone, that provide equity of experience regardless of a student's financial background. Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to actually consider this. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right that there were spaces I never thought twice about using, and probably spaces other students felt differently about. It was, Daniel thought, the beginning of awareness, if not quite understanding, but it was something, this acknowledgement that different people might have had different experiences of the same place. The presentation concluded with thanks from the board and assurances that they would review all proposals carefully before making a decision. As people stood and began to gather their materials, Professor Hartley came over to shake Daniel's hand, holding it warmly in both of hers. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished, she said quietly, and I hope the board chooses your proposal. I think you would bring exactly the right perspective to this project, would create something that truly serves the school's best vision of itself. Marcus approached as Professor Hartley moved away, his expression thoughtful. Daniel Chen, he said, as though testing the name, trying to fully place it. You were in my year at Riverside, weren't you? Class of 2013? I was, Daniel confirmed, keeping his tone friendly but neutral. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you right away. That was a long time ago, and I'm embarrassed to say I wasn't as aware of all my classmates as I should have been. There was something in Marcus's voice that suggested he might be starting to remember more specifically, might be beginning to access those old memories and seeing them differently through his current eyes. It was a big class, Daniel said easily, offering Marcus a kind of grace he had not earned, but that Daniel was willing to give anyway. And we all change a lot between 17 and 30. Still, Marcus said, and he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, your presentation was impressive. The way you think about architecture as being about more than just buildings, about how spaces shape experience and community, that's clearly born from deep thought and real understanding. I'll be recommending your proposal to the board. It was not an apology, not exactly, but it felt like something adjacent to one, an acknowledgement that Daniel deserved to be seen and heard and taken seriously. And that, Daniel realized, was enough. He did not need Marcus to remember specific unkindnesses, did not need confession or penance. He just needed to be recognized as competent, as valuable, as someone with something important to contribute. They shook hands, and Daniel gathered his materials and left Riverside Academy for the second time in his life. This time, walking to his car with his head up, his shoulders straight, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. The call came 3 weeks later. The Board of Trustees had chosen Daniel and Sarah's firm for the campus expansion project. The contract would be substantial, multi-year, high-profile. It would require Daniel to spend significant time at Riverside, working with administrators and faculty and students, thinking deeply about the school's past and future, making decisions that would shape the campus for decades to come. He accepted with gratitude and immediately began the next phase of work, diving into detailed site analysis, structural assessments, stakeholder interviews. He met with students, current ones, a diverse group that included both legacy admits and scholarship recipients, listening carefully to their experiences of the campus, their ideas about what worked and what could be better. One of the students, a shy girl on scholarship who reminded Daniel achingly of his younger self, mentioned feeling uncomfortable in the old common room because all the furniture seemed designed for people to spread out and claim territory, making it hard to find a place to sit and study without feeling like an intruder. Daniel made notes, thought about how different furniture arrangements and room layouts could make spaces feel more accessible, more welcoming to everyone. He met with faculty members, including Professor Hartley, who had been teaching at Riverside for nearly 30 years and had countless insights about how the physical campus affected pedagogy and community. She told him stories about students she had taught, the ones who had thrived and the ones who had struggled, and how much of that seemed connected to whether they felt they belonged in the physical spaces of the school. He met with the maintenance staff, people like Tom the groundskeeper, who remembered Daniel from his early morning walks and seemed delighted to have the chance to share decades of observations about which buildings worked well and which had persistent problems. These conversations were gold mines of practical information, revealing issues that no architectural survey would have caught, understanding that came from years of daily interaction with the campus. Daniel approached the project with the same careful attention he had brought to all his work, but with an added layer of personal investment. This was not just another commission. This was an opportunity to quite literally reshape the place that had shaped him, to take all the difficult lessons he had learned about exclusion and belonging and translate them into built form. The design phase took months of intensive work. Daniel and his team created plans that honored the historic buildings while updating them thoughtfully. They designed new structures that complemented the old ones in scale and materials while being unmistakably contemporary. They paid attention to details that might seem small, but that made significant differences in how welcoming spaces felt. The height of windows, the arrangement of furniture, the quality of light, the placement of doorways. The new student center, built in what had once been the old service building, became the heart of the project. Daniel designed it to feel both dignified and comfortable, with a soaring common space filled with natural light, with smaller nooks for quiet study or conversation, with resources and support services arranged in ways that did not require students to identify themselves as needing help in order to access them. The dormitory renovations address the inequities Daniel had experienced firsthand. Every student room, regardless of which building it was in, would now have adequate heating, good natural light, comfortable furniture, enough storage space. The old hierarchy of desirable and undesirable housing would be flattened through thoughtful design, making all the residential spaces equally pleasant places to live. As the project moved from design into construction, Daniel found himself spending more and more time at Riverside, meeting with contractors, solving problems that arose, making decisions about materials and finishes. He walked the campus almost daily, observing how people moved through spaces, noting what worked and what needed adjustment. One afternoon in early spring, about a year into the construction phase, he was standing in what would become the new student center, watching workers install windows, when Marcus Whitmore appeared at the entrance. He was still on the board of trustees, had been present at several update meetings, but had not sought Daniel out for individual conversation beyond professional courtesies. "I've been wanting to talk to you," Marcus said, walking over to where Daniel stood. "Do you have a few minutes?" They sat on a pair of sawhorses in the unfinished space, surrounded by the smell of fresh lumber and drywall dust, and Marcus was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about your presentation," he said finally, "about what you said about different students having different experiences of the campus. And I've been trying to remember what it was actually like when we were students here together. I've been remembering things I'm not particularly proud of." Daniel waited, not trying to make this easier for Marcus, but not making it harder either, just giving him space to say whatever he needed to say. "I remember there were students I barely noticed," Marcus continued, "students who were clearly working harder than I was, who took everything more seriously, who didn't participate in all the social stuff, and I remember feeling vaguely superior about that, like I had somehow figured out the real point of Riverside while they were missing it, grinding away at academics." He paused, looking around the unfinished space. "But you were seeing something I was blind to. You were seeing all the ways the place was designed for people like me and not for people like you. And instead of becoming bitter about it, instead of just leaving and never looking back, you became an architect and came back to try to make it better. That's remarkable." Daniel considered how to respond, wanting to be honest without being harsh. "I did leave for a long time, and I didn't come back out of some noble desire to fix the place. I came back because it's a good professional project and because I'm qualified to do it. But you're right that my experience here shaped how I think about architecture, about how spaces can include or exclude people, sometimes in ways that aren't immediately obvious." "I've been talking to my daughter lately," Marcus said, and Daniel felt a small shock of surprise. Marcus had a daughter old enough to have these conversations with. She's 14, and she's starting to think about high school, about where she might want to go, and I've been trying to figure out how to talk to her about privilege, about the fact that she'll have opportunities that not everyone has, about how to use those advantages responsibly rather than just taking them for granted. He laughed, a small, self-deprecating sound. I don't think I'm doing a very good job of it. But watching this project, seeing what you're building here, it's helping me understand what I should have understood when I was 17. That equity isn't about everyone having the same things, it's about everyone having what they need to thrive. That good design, good systems, good communities, they make space for everyone. That's a good lesson to teach your daughter, Daniel said quietly. And the fact that you're thinking about it, trying to figure it out, that matters. Most people never do. They sat together for a while longer, watching the workers, talking about the project, and about their lives in the years since Riverside. Marcus had indeed gone into his father's investment firm, had married someone from a similar background, was raising his children in the kind of neighborhood Daniel had once observed from the outside, but he seemed to be working to understand his privilege now in ways he had not as a younger man, seemed to be trying to raise his children with more awareness than he had been raised with. It was not a dramatic reconciliation, not a moment of grand apology or absolution. It was simply two men who had once moved through the same spaces with very different experiences, finding some common ground in middle age, acknowledging that they had both changed and grown and learned things since those days. As Marcus left, he paused at the door. I hope you'll come speak to the students when the building is finished. I think it would mean something for them to hear from the architect, especially knowing that you were once a student here yourself. Daniel agreed, and as he returned to his work, he felt something shift inside him, some old weight finally releasing. He had come back to Riverside carrying all those complicated memories, all those experiences of feeling invisible and excluded and less than. But in the process of this project, of literally rebuilding the campus, he had been rebuilding his relationship with the place as well, claiming it as part of his history without letting it define or limit him. The construction progressed through spring and summer and into the following autumn. Daniel watched the buildings transform, watched spaces that had once felt forbidding become welcoming, watched old inequities addressed through thoughtful design. The new student center rose in what had been the service building, its large windows bringing in light, its flexible spaces accommodating different needs and activities. The dormitories were gutted and rebuilt with care, every room becoming a place someone could feel genuinely comfortable and at home. The library expansion honored the beautiful old reading room while creating new spaces for collaboration and technology and different kinds of learning. When the project was finally complete, the school held a dedication ceremony on a crisp October afternoon, much like the one when Daniel had first arrived for his interview with the board. Current students and faculty and alumni gathered to tour the renovated and new spaces to celebrate the completion of a project that had transformed the campus. Professor Hartley found Daniel during the reception, her eyes bright with emotion. This is extraordinary work, Daniel. Truly. You've honored the school's history while making it so much more accessible and welcoming. I've already heard from several students about how much they love the new spaces, how different they feel from the old ones. The headmaster gave a speech thanking the donors and the board and the architecture firm, specifically mentioning Daniel's vision and leadership. And then, to Daniel's surprise, he invited Daniel to say a few words about the project. Daniel stood before the gathered community, looking out at faces both familiar and new, and thought about what he wanted to say. Not about architecture, necessarily, but about what this project had meant to him personally. When I was a student here many years ago, he began, his voice steady and clear, I had complicated feelings about this place. I was grateful for the scholarship that made it possible for me to attend, grateful for the education I received, grateful for teachers like Professor Hartley who saw potential in me and encouraged it, but I also often felt like the campus itself wasn't quite designed with someone like me in mind. There were spaces I felt uncomfortable entering, traditions I couldn't participate in, an overall sense that I was a guest in someone else's house rather than a full member of the community. He paused, seeing some current students nodding, recognizing themselves in his description. But that experience taught me something valuable. It taught me that architecture matters, that the physical spaces we create shape how people experience belonging and exclusion, that good design can make communities more equitable or less equitable depending on how thoughtful we are about it. So when I had the opportunity to come back and work on this campus expansion, I approached it not just as an architecture project, but as a chance to think deeply about how Riverside can better serve all its students, how we can honor our history while making sure that history doesn't become a barrier to inclusion, how we can create spaces that make everyone feel like they have a right to be here, like they belong here fully, and without qualification. I hope these new and renovated buildings serve that purpose. I hope they make Riverside a place where every student, regardless of their background or financial situation, can focus on learning and growing and becoming whoever they're meant to be. And I hope that those of you who graduate from here will carry forward an understanding that spaces matter, that equity matters, that we all have a responsibility to build a world where everyone has what they need to thrive. The audience applauded, and Daniel stepped back, feeling something close to peace settle over him. He had done what he came to do. He had taken the pain of his experience and transformed it into something constructive, something that might make things better for students he would never meet, students who would walk through these spaces long after he was gone. As the reception continued, Daniel found himself in conversation with one of the current scholarship students, the shy girl who had mentioned feeling uncomfortable in the old common room. She looked at him with wide eyes, clearly nervous about approaching someone she saw as important and accomplished. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you. The new student center is amazing. I was there yesterday, and for the first time since I got to Riverside, I felt like I could just exist in a space without worrying about whether I belonged there. The furniture and the light and the way the rooms are arranged, everything about it feels welcoming." Daniel felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. This was what it was all for. This was what made all the work worthwhile. Not the impressive portfolio project or the professional recognition or even the personal vindication of returning to Riverside in such a different role. It was this moment, knowing that his work had made one person's daily experience a little bit easier, a little bit better, a little bit more humane. "That means everything to me," he told her honestly. "Thank you for sharing that." As the afternoon faded toward evening, as the crowds dispersed and Daniel prepared to leave Riverside for what might be the last time, he took a final walk around the campus. The new and renovated buildings glowed warmly in the autumn light. Students moved through spaces with easy comfort, claiming them as their own. The old hierarchies of access and belonging had been at least partially dismantled, replaced with something more equitable, more generous, more true to the school's stated values, if not always its historical practice. Daniel thought about the boy he had been, sitting alone in the corner of the common room, feeling invisible and excluded, reading about Roman bridges and dreaming of a different future. He thought about all the years between that boy and this man, all the work and study and growth and change. He thought about Maya and James and Lynn, about how they had all found their own ways forward, had all built lives, and careers that honored where they came from while reaching toward something new. And he thought about the students who would come after, who would walk through these spaces he had designed, who would perhaps find them welcoming in ways the old spaces had not been. They would not know his name, most of them. They would not know the story of how these buildings came to be. But they would benefit from the work he had done, would have an easier time finding their place here than he had found his. That was enough. That was more than enough. As Daniel drove away from Riverside Academy for what he suspected was truly the final time, he felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication or proving anything to anyone. He had taken a difficult experience and transformed it into insight, had used his pain to develop empathy, had built something that would serve others long after the specific hurts that had motivated it were forgotten. The road ahead wound through the autumn landscape, trees brilliant with color, the evening air soft and clear. Daniel drove with the windows down, letting the cool air wash over him, feeling grateful for everything, the struggles and the successes, the exclusions and the recognitions, the boy he had been, and the man he had become. He thought about the bridges he had read about so long ago, those ancient Roman structures built to last, built to serve, built to connect people across divides that seemed impassable. That was what he had spent his life learning to do, in his own way, building bridges, creating connections, designing spaces that brought people together rather than keeping them apart. It was good work. It was meaningful work. It was exactly the work he had been meant to do. And as the campus disappeared in his rearview mirror, as the road carried him back toward his own life and his own future, Daniel felt something he had not felt since leaving Riverside all those years ago as a student. He felt complete. He felt whole. He felt at peace with his past and excited for his future and grateful for the winding path that had brought him here. The evening deepened around him as he drove, the sky turning shades of amber and rose and deepening blue. Somewhere behind him, students were settling into dormitory rooms that had been designed with care, were studying in a library that welcomed everyone equally, were gathering in a student center that made space for all of them, regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. And somewhere ahead there were other projects waiting, other buildings to design, other opportunities to create spaces that served people, that honored them, that made their lives a little bit easier and more dignified. Daniel drove toward that future with quiet contentment, with the satisfaction of someone who had taken the raw materials of his life, the challenges and the gifts, the pain and the growth, and built from them something sturdy and beautiful and true, something that would last, like those ancient Roman bridges, serving purposes he could not fully imagine, connecting people he would never meet, standing as quiet testimony to the idea that how we treat each other matters, that the spaces we create shape the communities we become, that every person deserves to move through the world with dignity and belonging. The road stretched out before him, and Daniel followed it with an open heart, ready for whatever came next, grateful for everything that had brought him to this moment. The autumn evening wrapped around him like a soft blanket, the world settling into that gentle space between day and night, between what had been and what would come. And in that soft, liminal space, Daniel Chen drove forward into his life with peace in his heart and hope for the future, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that he had done good work, had built something meaningful, had transformed old pain into new possibility. The stars began to emerge overhead as the last light faded from the sky, tiny points of brightness in the deepening dark. Daniel watched them through the windshield as he drove, these ancient lights that had witnessed so much human striving and struggle and growth, and he felt connected to something larger than himself, part of a long story of people trying to build things that would last, trying to make the world a little bit better than they found it, trying to create spaces and systems and communities where everyone could thrive. It was enough to have tried. It was enough to have cared. It was enough to have taken his particular experiences and particular pain and particular understanding and turned them into something constructive, something healing, something that served not just his own need for resolution, but the larger need for spaces that welcomed everyone, that made room for everyone, that honored the dignity and potential of every person who walked through them. Daniel drove on through the quiet evening, and gradually, as the rhythm of the road worked its gentle magic, he felt himself relaxing completely, felt the last traces of old tension leaving his shoulders, felt himself settling into a deep and peaceful contentment that had been building for years, but that only now, in this moment, felt fully complete. The boy who had sat alone in the corner of the common room reading about bridges had grown into a man who built them. The student who had felt invisible had become an architect whose work made others visible. The person who had struggled to find his place had created places where others could belong. It was a good story. It was a true story. It was his story, and he was proud of it. And as the miles passed and the evening deepened into night, Daniel let himself simply be present with that truth, simply hold it with gratitude and wonder at the mysterious way that difficult things can become the foundation for meaningful things, that pain can become insight, that exclusion can become empathy, that one person's struggle can become another person's comfort. The road carried him forward, toward home, toward rest, toward sleep and dreams and tomorrow. Behind him lay Riverside Academy, transformed now, better than it had been, more true to what it could be. Ahead lay the rest of his life, full of possibility and purpose and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. And in this moment, driving through the autumn night with stars overhead and peace in his heart, Daniel was exactly where he needed to be, exactly who he needed to be, moving through the world with the gentle strength of someone who had faced difficulty and not been broken by it, who had experienced injustice and responded by working to create more justice, who had felt small and had grown large enough to make sure others did not have to feel that way. The night wrapped around him like a benediction, like a blessing, like a promise that tomorrow would come with its own challenges and opportunities, but that he was ready for them, prepared by everything he had learned and experienced and become. Daniel drove on through the darkness toward home, toward rest, toward sleep, the road beneath him solid and sure, the stars above him ancient and bright, his heart at peace with all that had been and all that would come. Grateful for the journey, grateful for the growth, grateful for the opportunity to have built something good and true and lasting from the difficult materials of his young life. And as the miles passed and sleep began to tug at the edges of his consciousness, as his body relaxed completely and his breathing deepened and slowed, Daniel let himself drift into that soft space between waking and sleeping, between effort and rest, between the doing and the being, knowing that he had done enough, had been enough, had become someone his younger self would have been proud of, someone who had taken pain and transformed it into purpose, someone who had learned to build not just buildings, but also a life of meaning and dignity and quiet triumph. The road unwound beneath him, carrying him forward, carrying him home, carrying him toward rest and peace and the deep, healing sleep that comes when you have finally, truly, completely made peace with your past and can face your future with an open heart and steady hands and the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are and what they are worth and where they belong in the world. Daniel drove on through the gentle night, and the story that had begun so many years ago in difficulty and exclusion found its resolution in triumph and inclusion, in peace and purpose, in the understanding that we are all building something every day, with every choice we make, with every space we create, with every person we honor or diminish, and that the work of building a more just and equitable world is never finished but is always worthwhile, always meaningful, always worth the effort it requires. The night deepened. Around him, soft and dark and full of stars, and Daniel Chen drove toward home with peace in his heart and gratitude in his soul. Ready for rest, ready for sleep, ready to let go of the day and drift into dreams, knowing that tomorrow would come with its own purposes and possibilities, but that tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it needed to be, exactly right.